October 2009. In a mountainous area of Oklahoma, an abandoned pickup truck was discovered by chance. The vehicle stood in the middle of a wooded landscape, far from residential homes and main roads. At first glance, it looked as if the owners had simply stepped away for a short time and were expected to return at any moment. The truck was locked, and there were no signs of an accident or struggle nearby. The forest remained quiet and completely still, and nothing about the scene immediately suggested a crime. However, once investigators opened the vehicle, it became clear that the situation was far stranger than it had first appeared. You're watching Nexiya, and this is the story of a family who set out to look at a new place to start their life, but never returned home. Inside the truck, investigators found mobile phones, wallets containing identification documents, keys, warm clothing, and a GPS device. Everything people would normally take with them, even during a brief stop. On the back seat was the family's small dog. The animal was alive but severely weakened, as if it had spent several days trapped inside the vehicle without food or water. During the inspection, detectives made another discovery that immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Beneath one of the seats lay $32,000 in cash, carefully bundled and completely untouched. The finding defied logic. People who willingly disappear do not leave behind that kind of money, and those who become victims of robbery rarely keep it safe inside the vehicle. What raised even more questions was that not just one person was missing. The truck belonged to an entire family: Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilynn, and their 6-year-old daughter, Madyson. There were no signs of a struggle, no messages, and no attempts to contact relatives. It seemed as though they had simply stepped out of the vehicle and vanished without a trace among the trees. At first, police assumed the family may have become lost in the difficult mountainous terrain. But with each passing day of searching, that explanation became less convincing. Everything necessary for survival had been left inside the truck, and the circumstances did not match the behavior of people who had accidentally found themselves in danger. Investigators soon began examining the family's life before the trip. Very quickly, it became clear that something unusual had been happening to the Jamisons. Even before their disappearance, something that led many to question whether this journey had truly been an ordinary family outing. Before they vanished, the Jamison family lived in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma. From the outside, their life appeared relatively normal. Bobby Jamison worked in construction and occasionally took on contract jobs, while his wife Sherilynn spent most of her time at home raising their daughter, Madyson. Their house stood in a quiet neighborhood, and neighbors described the family as private but not problematic. They rarely socialized, did not participate in community activities, and almost never invited guests over. The Jamisons tended to keep to themselves, yet at first, nothing about their behavior seemed openly suspicious. 6-year-old Madyson was the center of their world. Relatives remembered her as a calm and kind child who was deeply attached to her parents. According to those who knew the family, Bobby was especially devoted to his daughter and spent most of his free time with her. However, about a year before the disappearance, the situation within the family began to change. The Jamisons were experiencing financial difficulties. Bobby's work became increasingly unstable, and conflicts between the couple grew more frequent. According to relatives, tension inside the home had become constant. The greatest concern, however, was Sherilynn's behavior. She suffered from chronic back pain following a car accident and was taking strong prescription pain medication. Over time, relatives began noticing significant changes in her personality. She became increasingly suspicious and withdrawn, frequently speaking about people she believed were watching or following their family. At the same time, tensions within the family escalated due to an ongoing conflict with Bobby's relatives. Mutual accusations, financial disputes, and strained relationships eventually led to a complete breakdown in communication. According to some accounts, the situation intensified into open arguments and deep mistrust between family members. Not long after, the Jamisons began discussing a radical decision, leaving the town entirely and moving far away from other people. They dreamed of purchasing land in the Bois mountains and living in near isolation, with little to no contact with neighbors. The idea of a secluded life appeared to them as a chance to start over and escape the fears and problems that had been building for years. All of this created a deeply conflicting picture. On one hand, there was a family planning a fresh start, searching for peace in a remote place far from society. On the other, there was growing isolation, fear, and behavior that investigators would later describe as deeply concerning. It was during this period that the Jamisons decided to travel into the mountains to personally inspect the property, where they hoped to begin their new life. That decision would become the last confirmed step the family ever took together. On the morning of October 8, 2009, the Jamison family left their home in Eufaula. According to relatives, they planned to drive to a mountainous area in Latimer County, located roughly an hour and a half from their house. The land they intended to visit was being considered as the site of their future home. By that time, the idea of living far from civilization had become almost an obsession. The Jamisons wanted to begin again in isolation, away from neighbors, conflicts, and the fears they believed had surrounded their family in recent months. They took with them their only daughter, Madyson, along with the family dog. Nothing suggested that the trip would be anything more than a routine visit to inspect property. They did not inform relatives about any extended travel plans and packed only minimal belongings, indicating that they intended to return home the same day. Before leaving town, the Jamisons stopped at a local store. It was there that surveillance cameras captured them for the final time. The footage would later become one of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence in the case. The video shows Bobby and Sherilynn slowly entering the store with their daughter. Their behavior immediately drew the attention of investigators. The couple barely spoke to one another, moved unusually slowly, and appeared visibly tense. They remained near the entrance for an extended period, as if struggling to decide what to do next. Sherilynn repeatedly glanced over her shoulder, seemingly checking whether someone was watching them. Bobby kept a noticeable distance even from his own wife, and their movements appeared cautious and unnatural. Detectives later stated that watching the footage created the impression that the family was under significant emotional stress or fear. After purchasing only a small number of items, they left the store. It was the last confirmed moment the Jamison family was ever seen alive. Later, investigators obtained footage from a surveillance camera installed outside the Jamison family home shortly before their disappearance. The video shows Bobby and Sherilynn slowly carrying belongings to their vehicle for nearly 20 minutes. their behavior appeared unusual. They moved slowly, barely spoke to one another, and at times stopped in the middle of the yard without any clear reason, as if losing focus or struggling to complete simple tasks. Detectives who reviewed the footage later noted that the couple appeared exhausted and disoriented. At certain moments, they simply stood still, looking in different directions, creating the impression of intense emotional strain or deep anxiety, even before the family set out on what would become their final trip. After leaving home, the family drove toward the Bois Mountains, a remote region known for dense forests, narrow dirt roads, and almost complete absence of cellular service. The area was sparsely populated, and even local residents rarely traveled there without a specific reason. That same day, all contact with the family suddenly stopped. They did not answer phone calls, failed to return home, and did not appear at any scheduled commitments. At first, relatives assumed the couple had simply been delayed or decided to stay overnight outside the city. But as the hours passed, concern steadily grew. Within days, it became clear that the family had disappeared without explanation. At that time, no one yet knew that their vehicle was already sitting abandoned deep in the mountains, and that the search for answers would eventually turn the case into one of the most mysterious family disappearances in the United States. When the Jamison family stopped responding, no one initially suspected the worst. Loved ones believed they might have extended their trip or chosen to spend additional time away from town. However, days passed with no contact, and concern quickly escalated into an official search operation. Local law enforcement, volunteers, and rescue teams joined the effort. The region the Jamisons had traveled to proved extremely difficult to search. Dense woods, rolling hills, and countless barely visible dirt roads made the operation slow and complicated. Several days after the search began, one of the search teams discovered the family's white pickup truck. The vehicle was located in a mountainous area of Latimer County, along a narrow road leading deep into the forest. The truck stood upright and undamaged, as though it had been deliberately parked. There were no signs of an accident or struggle nearby. The ground showed no evidence of panic, overturned belongings, or attempts to flee the area quickly. The scene appeared calm, unnaturally calm for the disappearance of an entire family. After investigators opened the vehicle, the mystery deepened further. Inside were the Jamisons' personal belongings: mobile phones, wallets containing identification, house keys, clothing, and a navigation device. Everything suggested that the family had not intended to leave the truck for long. Among the items, detectives recovered Bobby's mobile phone. Stored inside were photographs of Madyson taken earlier that same day during the trip into the mountains. Many observers later focused on Madyson's expression in those images. In the photographs, she appears unusually serious and tense. Whether she was frightened or simply tired from the journey remains unknown. However, these pictures became the last recorded images of the family before their disappearance. On the back seat, officers found the family dog. The animal was alive but severely dehydrated and exhausted. According to veterinary assessments, the dog had likely remained inside the locked vehicle for several days without proper care. This indicated that the owners had left the truck suddenly and never returned, not even to retrieve their pet. The most shocking discovery was made during a detailed examination of the vehicle's interior. Beneath one of the seats lay a large amount of cash, $32,000. The money was carefully bundled, and completely untouched. This detail immediately placed investigators at a dead end. The theory of robbery no longer made sense, as any attacker would almost certainly have taken such a sum. At the same time, voluntary disappearance seemed equally unlikely, since people who intentionally vanish rarely leave behind their financial resources. Even more unsettling was the absence of any clear signs showing where the family had gone next. Investigators found no distinct footprints or tracks near the vehicle that could indicate the direction in which they had traveled. It was as if 3 people had simply stepped out of the truck and dissolved into the surrounding forest. Search teams immediately began combing the nearby area. Tracking dogs, aerial drones, and thermal imaging equipment were deployed. Ravines, abandoned mines, dense vegetation, and steep hillsides were carefully examined. Yet despite the mashup of the operation, no trace of Bobby, Sherilynn, or little Madyson was found. From that moment on, the case no longer resembled a typical disappearance in the wilderness. The vehicle became the only silent clue, the place where the story seemed to abruptly end, leaving behind far more questions than answers. After the abandoned truck was discovered, investigators shifted their focus to the Jamison family's life prior to their disappearance. The deeper detectives looked into their background, the more details emerged that began to change the overall perception of the case. During a search of the Jamison home, officers noticed a strange atmosphere inside. The house did not appear to have been abandoned in haste, yet it carried a strong sense of isolation. The windows were tightly covered, and surveillance cameras had been installed around the property, aimed toward the yard and the driveway. According to acquaintances, Bobby had recently spoken more frequently about the need to protect his family. While examining the property, investigators also noticed a metal storage container located near the house. Its exterior walls were covered in handwritten messages made by Sherilynn. In these writings, she asked for protection and described an invisible threat that she believed was hanging over the family. Sherilynn's personal writings raised even greater concern. Detectives discovered numerous notes containing religious and mystical references. They mentioned spiritual dangers, dark forces, and unseen enemies from whom she believed protection was necessary. Some writings included prayers for safety and references to something malevolent existing near the family. Relatives later confirmed that Sherilynn's behavior had changed significantly in the months leading up to the disappearance. She had become increasingly suspicious, rarely left the house, and repeatedly told those close to her that someone was watching them. She reported receiving threats to the police, yet investigators were unable to find any evidence confirming that the family was actually being followed. At the same time, investigators determined that the couple had been experiencing serious financial difficulties. Bobby's work remained unstable while expenses continued to grow. According to some reports, the family may have had indirect connections with individuals involved in the illegal distribution of controlled substances, although no official charges were ever filed. This possibility only added further uncertainty to an already complex case. An even more disturbing discovery was a letter written by Sherilynn shortly before the disappearance. In it, she expressed deep resentment and anger toward her husband. The tone of the writing sharply contrasted with the way the family presented themselves in public, creating the impression of a hidden conflict that very few people had been aware of. Neighbors also recalled unusual incidents. The couple rarely left their home and sometimes remained inside for days at a time. They avoided conversations and often appeared exhausted. Some acquaintances later suggested that the fear the family seemed to experience was entirely real to them, even if its source remained unclear to those around them. Gradually, investigators began to see a complicated picture emerge. A family attempting to escape their problems had isolated themselves to such an extent that the boundary between a real external threat and internal fear may have slowly begun to disappear. It was during this period that the Jamisons made the decision to travel into the mountains, a place they believed would offer a new beginning, a decision after which none of them would ever be seen alive again. If you are interested in real stories where the answers sometimes become more disturbing than the events themselves, consider subscribing to the channel. Ahead lies the conclusion of this case, a mystery that left investigators without explanations even years later. After the abandoned vehicle was discovered, the search for the Jamison family continued for several weeks. Rescue teams combed through the mountainous terrain using search dogs and specialized equipment, yet no trace of the missing family was found. Over time, the active phase of the operation was suspended. The case gradually shifted into the category of unresolved disappearances. Months passed, and eventually years. For investigators, only the abandoned truck remained, along with the strange circumstances preceding the disappearance and the complete absence of evidence explaining what had happened in the mountains that day. Nearly 4 years went by. In November 2013, 2 hunters traveling through a remote area of Latimer County accidentally discovered human remains. The location was situated only a few kilometers from where the Jamison vehicle had previously been found. Police quickly arrived at the scene and secured the area. Further examination confirmed the worst fears. In the wooded terrain, the remains of 3 individuals were discovered: an adult man, a woman, and a child. Forensic analysis later confirmed that they were Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson Jamison. The remains had been exposed to the elements for several years, significantly complicating efforts to determine the circumstances of death. Due to natural decomposition and environmental exposure, medical examiners were unable to establish an exact cause of death. No evidence of gunshot wounds was found, nor were there convincing signs of a violent death. At the same time, natural causes could not be confirmed either. In reality, investigators received an answer to only one question. The family was no longer missing, but what had actually happened to them remained a complete mystery. Another troubling detail was the location of the remains. They were found relatively close to the abandoned vehicle, yet the terrain did not appear so difficult that healthy adults would have been unable to return to the truck or find help. This raised new questions. Why had the family left the vehicle, and why were they unable to save themselves? Investigators considered multiple possibilities, ranging from disorientation in the wilderness to the potential involvement of third parties. However, no single theory was able to explain all of the circumstances at once. After the remains were identified, the Jamison case was officially reclassified as an unresolved death investigation. The family that had traveled into the mountains in search of a new beginning was found only years later, without witnesses, without clear evidence, and without any understandable explanation for what occurred during the final hours of their lives. Following the discovery of the remains, the investigation reached only a partial conclusion. The missing family had been located, yet the central question remained unanswered. What exactly happened to them in the mountains of Oklahoma? Over the years, law enforcement officials and independent researchers proposed several primary theories. The first considered the possibility of a tragic accident. According to this theory, the family may have left the vehicle while attempting to locate the property or search for a path, eventually becoming disoriented within the rugged terrain. The lack of cellular service, sudden temperature changes, and physical exhaustion could have led to a fatal outcome. However, this explanation raised doubts. The distance between the vehicle and the location of the remains was not extreme, and experienced adults typically remain near their vehicle, which serves as the most visible reference point for rescuers. Another theory suggested the involvement of third parties. The region where the Jamisons disappeared had at times been associated with illegal production of controlled substances. It was proposed that the family may have accidentally entered someone else's territory or become involved in a conflict. Nevertheless, investigators found no convincing evidence of other individuals at the scene or signs of violence. The large amount of cash discovered inside the vehicle also drew significant attention. Despite years of investigation, authorities were never able to definitively determine the origin of the $32,000. Some acquaintances stated that the Jamisons had been experiencing financial difficulties, making the presence of such a sum difficult to explain. This detail led to speculation about possible connections to illegal activity or financial disputes. However, no evidence was ever uncovered that directly supported this theory, and the question surrounding the money's origin remains unresolved. Some investigators also suggested that prolonged stress, isolation, and growing paranoia may have influenced the family's decision to leave the vehicle. If even one of the adults had been experiencing severe psychological distress, it could have resulted in fatal decision-making in an unfamiliar environment. Yet even this theory failed to explain why the entire family walked away from the truck together and never returned. There were also more controversial assumptions, ranging from a possible family conflict to the idea of a deliberate disappearance that ultimately ended in tragedy. However, the lack of evidence prevented investigators from confirming any of these theories. As a result, the Jamison case became one of those rare investigations in which every explanation appears partially believable, yet none provides a complete answer. The vehicle remained where it was found. The money was never taken. The phones fell silent, and the final hours of the family's lives remain forever hidden within the forests of Oklahoma. Even today, investigators admit that they know where the Jamisons were found, but they still do not know what compelled them to take their final steps into the woods. Many years have passed since the disappearance of the Jamison family. The forest in the Oklahoma mountains has long since returned to its natural calm, and the place where the abandoned pickup once stood looks no different from countless other stretches of wilderness. Yet the story itself has never truly reached an ending. Investigators found the vehicle. They found personal belongings. Eventually, they found the family themselves. But between those discoveries lies a span of time that remains impossible to explain. What caused 3 people to leave the safety of their vehicle in such a remote location? Why did they never return? And what happened during those final hours for which no witness and no evidence remain? Inside the truck, there was money, enough to begin a new life. phones that could have called for help, and a dog that waited for owners who would never come back. Sometimes the most disturbing cases are not those marked by obvious violence, but those without a clear enemy. No gunshot, no struggle, no single moment that can be identified as the beginning of tragedy. Only the decision to take a few steps into the forest, and the silence that followed. What truly happened to the Jamison family? A tragic accident, the involvement of others, or fear that slowly spiraled out of control, remains an open question to this day. What do you think? What forced the family to leave their vehicle that day? Share your theory in the comments. This was Nexiya, and I'll see you in the next story.